In the 1,980 seconds, there was a name that made every director in Hollywood tremble and every audience member fall in love. Debra Winger. She wasn't just a movie star. She was an atmospheric shift, 3 Oscar nominations in a single decade. The raw, gravelly voice of a woman who seemed to have lived 1,000 lives before she even turned 30. To the industry, she was the it girl. To the audience, she was the only real person on screen. But look at her now. If you walked past her on a street in Manhattan today, you wouldn't blink. You wouldn't see the woman who stood toe-to-toe with Richard Gere or Jack Nicholson. To the paparazzi, she is a ghost. To the studios, she is a cautionary tale. But to Debra, she is a woman who finally found the light. Most people think she was just difficult. They say she was crazy, or that she simply aged out of a business that worships youth. They are wrong. The smoking gun of Debra Winger's disappearance isn't a bad movie or a lost contract. It traces back to a terrifying second in 1973, when a teenage girl sat on the back of a moving truck at an amusement park, and the world turned upside down. That moment of twisted metal didn't just break her body. It rewired her soul. It destroyed her ability to tell a lie. Today, we look past the red carpets and the fabricated smiles. We go back to the darkness of a hospital room and the exact moment a legend decided to vanish. This is the heartbreaking reality and the radical victory of Debra Winger. Before the Oscars, before the fame, there was just Debra. A girl from Ohio who landed in California with the sun in her hair and no interest in the spotlight. It was 1973. Debra was 18 years old, working a summer job at an amusement park. She was sitting on the back of a truck, moving through the park grounds. Just a routine day, just a way to pass the time. Then, one bump, one slip, fate reached out its hand. The truck overturned. Debra was thrown into the machinery. The diagnosis was a nightmare. A massive cerebral hemorrhage. Half of her body was paralyzed. Her sight was gone. She was 18 years old, and she was blind. The doctors stood at the foot of her bed and whispered the words that usually end a story. You will never walk again. You will never see again. For 10 months, Debra Winger lived in total, absolute darkness. Imagine that silence. For a girl who loved the world, being trapped inside her own skull was a special kind of hell. Most people never experience that level of isolation. No lights, no faces, no mirrors. No future she could see. But it was in that darkness that a new woman was born. According to those close to her, it was there that a vow quietly formed. A deal with the universe. She promised that if she ever walked again, if she ever saw the light again, she would never waste another second pretending. She would never smile on command just to make someone else comfortable. She would never say words she didn't believe. She had seen the back of the backdrop before she even knew what a movie set was. She knew how fragile the world was, and she realized that most people spend their lives worshiping illusions. When her sight finally returned, it wasn't cinematic. There was no swelling music, just shapes, light, and a sobering understanding. Survival comes with a price. Debra Winger didn't just walk out of that hospital. She marched. She emerged changed, sharper, less patient, unwilling to tolerate the nonsense that Hollywood calls normal. She was ready for her close-up. But Hollywood. Hollywood wasn't ready for a woman who had already died once. The stage was set for a collision that would change the industry forever. A collision between a girl who had lived in the dark and a business built on fake light. By 1980, Hollywood thought they had found their next great product. They saw a girl with a gravel voice and a look that was part tomboy, part goddess. They saw dollar signs. In Urban Cowboy, she stood next to John Travolta at the time, the biggest star in the world, and she didn't just hold her own. She stole the screen. She was sissy. She was the grit, the sweat, and the heart of the film. Audiences didn't just watch her. But while the industry was busy trying to figure out how to package her, Debra was busy honoring her hospital oath. No more lies, no more pretending. Then came 1982. An officer and a gentleman. To the world, this was the ultimate cinematic romance. The ending where Gere, in his crisp white uniform, sweeps her off her feet is etched into the collective memory of every moviegoer. It was the dream Hollywood was built to sell. But for Debra Winger, it was a nightmare. While we saw passion, Debra felt a brick wall. That was her name for Richard Gere, a brick wall. She found him cold, distant, and trapped in his own image. She found the director, Taylor Hackford, to be, in her own words, an animal. She wasn't just unhappy. She was in open revolt against the artifice of the production. On set, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She refused to play the part of the grateful starlet. She saw the machinery of the movie, the manipulative music, the forced sentimentality, and she found it dishonest. Most actresses would have smiled for the cameras, played the chemistry game, and quietly collected their Oscar nomination. Not Debra. She did the unthinkable. She called the movie commercial trash. Out loud, in public. She refused to participate in the press tour, dismissing the film's romantic framing as a hollow product. Imagine the shock in the boardrooms of Paramount Pictures. Their new golden girl was calling their biggest hit garbage. This was the birth of the difficult label. To the men in suits, she was a problem to be solved. But to Debra, she was just staying true to the darkness she had seen in 1973. She knew that if you let Hollywood put a leash on you, they will never let go. And she had already decided she wasn't a pet. Behind the scenes of every great performance, there is a hidden antagonist. For Debra Winger, it wasn't just a rival actress or a demanding director. It was a two-headed monster. The first head was her own body. The hemorrhage from 1973 hadn't just left a scar on her brain, it left a vibe of permanent urgency. She lived with chronic pulsing headaches. She was hypersensitive to light, the very thing Hollywood is made of. This is why she always seemed to be squinting on set, why her gaze was so piercing and angry. She wasn't just acting, she was in physical pain. She felt she was on borrowed time, and she didn't have a single second to waste on small talk or the fake rituals of stardom. The second head of that monster was the system. Hollywood in the mid-1980s was becoming the playground of the mega producer, men like Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer. They didn't want artists who questioned the script. They wanted decorations. They wanted women who would look pretty, hit their marks, and stay quiet while the men built the blockbusters. Debra was often the only person in the room brave enough to tell them, "This is fake." She was a woman in a man's world who refused to speak the language of submission. In a legendary 1986 interview, she said it clearly, "I have seen the back of the backdrop. Once you see the nails and the scaffolding holding Hollywood up, you can never believe in the magic again." That quote was her death warrant in the eyes of the studio bosses. They began to build a cage for her, made entirely of rumors. The phrase difficult woman has always sounded personal, but in Hollywood it is institutional. It doesn't describe bad behavior, it describes resistance. Resistance to being softened. Resistance to being redirected. Producers valued speed, scale, and predictability. Debra brought friction. She asked why. She pushed back, and she refused to absorb humiliation silently. The industry heard her truth as a betrayal. They began to realize that Debra Winger wasn't just a star they couldn't control. She was a star who didn't want to be controlled. And in a town built on leverage, that made her the most dangerous woman in California. The fate was closing in. The queen of the 80 seconds was about to find herself at a crossroads where the only way to save her life was to let her career die. Every actor has a what-if story, but Debra Winger's what-ifs are the stuff of Hollywood legend. By the mid-80 seconds, she was the first choice for everything. The scripts were piled high on her desk. She was the queen of the mountain, holding the keys to the kingdom. But remember that hospital promise from 1973? No more lies. That promise was about to cost her hundreds of millions of dollars. In an industry that measures wisdom by longevity and profit, what Debra did next was seen as insanity. It was career suicide packaged as a choice. Let's talk about 1990, a movie called Pretty Woman. The role of Vivian Ward was written with Debra in mind. It was her movie to lose. But when she read the script, she didn't see a modern-day fairy tale. She saw a story that glamorized a dangerous reality. She saw a script that she felt was offensive to the intelligence of women. She didn't just say no. She walked away with a look of disgust that the studio executives never forgot. That role turned Julia Roberts into a global icon and the highest-paid woman in the world. Debra didn't care. Then came Fatal Attraction. She said no. Then came Ghost. She said no. To the agents in Beverly Hills, this was a tragedy. They saw a fortune being burned. But Debra saw something else. She called these scripts soul debts. A soul debt isn't just a bad job. It's a role that requires you to betray your understanding of what it means to be a fully formed human being. She believed that if she took those roles just for the money or the fame, she would be lying to the 18-year-old girl who had been blind in that hospital bed. For our audience watching today, you know the cruelty of time. You know that a single no can change the next 30 years of your life. Debra was choosing integrity over legacy. She was making herself smaller in the eyes of the public, but she was becoming a giant in her own mirror. But Hollywood doesn't reward giants who won't play along. They were getting ready to replace her with someone more agreeable. And the final explosion was only months away. 1991. The movie was A League of Their Own. This was supposed to be Debra's big return to the center of the frame. She loved the story. She loved the idea of playing Dottie Hinson, the gritty, reluctant leader of a women's baseball team during World War II. She was serious about it. She spent 3 months in the dirt, training, sweating, and learning how to throw, hit, and slide like a professional. She treated the role with the same intensity she brought to every character. She was ready to make a masterpiece. But then, the machine intervened. The director, Penny Marshall, made a casting choice that shifted the entire DNA of the project. She hired Madonna. At that moment, the movie changed. In Debra's eyes, it was no longer an authentic story about women's struggles and athleticism. To her, it had become a circus. It had become a marketing tool designed to sell pop culture spectacle rather than truth. Debra walked into Penny Marshall's office. She didn't scream. She didn't throw a fit. She looked at the woman who was her friend and said, "You are making an Elvis movie. You are making commercial trash, and I want to make art." Before anyone could stop her, Debra packed her bags. She walked off the field. She walked away from 3 months of grueling physical labor. But here is the part that proves who Debra Winger really was. She didn't just quit. She returned her entire salary, every single penny, just so the studio would let her out of her contract. In Hollywood, stars fight for more money. They demand rewrites. They threaten lawsuits. They do not give the money back. The gesture stunned everyone. The industry didn't see a woman of principle. They saw a woman they could no longer control. That was the breaking point. The labels became permanent and unforgiving. Impossible, unstable, toxic. The phone. And in 1995, after one final, quiet film, the screen went dark. The woman who had ruled the 80 seconds simply vanished into the shadows of New York. The exile had officially begun. Most Hollywood stories end with a bank account at zero, a mansion in foreclosure, or a star begging for a role in a low-budget horror flick. The industry understands downfall. It knows how to package a tragedy, but it does not understand withdrawal. The financial collapse of Debra Winger was something far more rare, and to the studio bosses, far more terrifying. It was voluntary. Between 1982 and 1993, Debra was one of the highest-paid women on the planet. Her paycheck for a single film ranged between $1 and $2.5 million. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $7 to $9 million per project. She was sitting on a mountain of gold. She was bankable. She was safe. But then, she did the math of the soul. From 1995 to 2001, Debra Winger earned exactly $0 from the Hollywood machine. Think about that for a moment. While her peers like Meryl Streep or Glenn Close were building massive fortunes and securing their seats at the high table, Debra was walking through the streets of New York as a civilian. She wasn't just resting. She wasn't waiting for the right script. She was walking away from an estimated $20 to $30 million in potential income. To the accountants in Beverly Hills, this was a tragedy of epic proportions. To them, she had lost everything. But Debra saw it through the lens of opportunity cost. She traded the mansions and the private jets for the right to read books to her children, the right to teach at Harvard, the right to work for charities without a camera crew following her to document her kindness. She traded visibility for autonomy. She had committed the ultimate sin. She showed the world that she didn't need the machine to be happy. She proved that the industry's greatest weapon, the fear of being forgotten, had no power over her. But as she found her peace, the cruelty of time was still working in the background. While she was finding herself, her image was being systematically erased. Hollywood can forgive a scandal. It can forgive a crime. It can even forgive a box office bomb. But there is one thing it will never, ever forgive: aging, especially for a woman. For Debra Winger, this was the final battlefield. Remember the hidden antagonist? The trauma from the 1973 crash? It had left her with a body that was hypersensitive to artificiality. She hated the bright clinical lights of the plastic surgeon's office just as much as she hated the fake lights of a film set. In the late 90 seconds, as the lines began to form around those famous, piercing eyes, Debra made a choice that was even more shocking than walking away from Pretty Woman. She chose to stay real. She looked at the other actresses of her generation, women who were freezing their faces into masks of plastic and Botox to remain marketable, and she refused to join the negotiation. She did not reshape her nose. She did not erase her history. The industry called it a decay. They whispered that she had let herself go. She told a reporter, "I want to find a reality where I don't have to hear someone say I need plastic surgery to be allowed to exist." Because she refused to hide the passage of time, she became invisible to the major studios. They didn't know how to market a woman who looked like a human being. They wanted a fantasy, and she was offering accuracy. The physical toll wasn't a tragedy to her. The gray hair and the age spots were her badges of honor. They were the proof that she had survived the 1973 crash, survived the 80-second circus, and survived the system. But being honest meant being exiled. She had won the war for her soul, but she had lost her kingdom. And the end of the story was about to reveal the true, lasting cost of saying no. By the turn of the millennium, Debra Winger had become more than just an actress. She had become a verb. In Hollywood circles, to do a Debra Winger meant to disappear when you were still wanted, to walk away while the money was still on the table, to choose the exit before the industry showed you the door. She had become a ghost that haunted the halls of every major studio. Every female star who hit the age of 40 looked at the empty space Debra left behind and felt a cold shiver of recognition. In 2002, her friend and colleague Rosanna Arquette set out to find her. She made a documentary titled Searching for Debra Winger. She interviewed the biggest stars in the world, and every single one of them admitted the same terrifying truth. Hollywood has a use-by date for women. They all wanted to know how Debra had the courage to say no before the industry said it for her. It was here that the industry's secret weapon was finally named, the Debra Winger Award. It wasn't an honor. It was a warning disguised as a joke. It described what happens to a woman who crosses an invisible line. When she questions power, when she refuses to reshape her face, when she demands to be treated as an artist rather than a product. The award arrived quietly. Fewer calls, shorter meetings. Then, nothing. But when Rosanna finally found her, The answer was devastatingly simple. Debra didn't have a secret plan. She didn't have a hidden illness. She just had a life. She told the camera, "I wanted to find a life where I was more than just a face on a screen." For those of you watching today, you understand the beauty of that silence. You know that there is a time in every life where the noise of the world, the pressure to produce, to succeed, to be seen, becomes too much. Debra Winger was the only one brave enough to choose the quiet. She had traded the Oscar for the morning coffee with her family. She had traded the red carpet for the dirt of her own garden. But Hollywood never forgave her for showing them that they weren't necessary. They had turned her into a cautionary tale of a difficult woman, when in reality, she was just a woman who had finally found the light she lost in 1973. So, what is the real tragedy of Debra Winger? Is it the millions of dollars she walked away from? Is it the Oscars she didn't win because she refused to play the political game? Or is it the biological honesty of her gray hair and her wrinkles? No, the tragedy isn't hers, it's ours. The tragedy is that we live in a world that makes a woman feel she has to choose between her soul and her success. Debra Winger didn't fail. She didn't fall. She made the most stoic decision a human being can make. She decided that she was enough. Without the makeup, without the scripts, without the applause. To our audience today, the generation that remembers the mechanical bull and the white uniform, Debra's story is a mirror. She reminds us that the price of fame is often the person you were meant to be. She reminds us that the cruelty of time is only cruel if you are fighting it. When you see those photos of her today, a woman of 70 who actually looks 70, don't feel pity, feel respect. She is the only one who didn't let Hollywood win. She is the woman who looked at the back of the backdrop, saw the scaffolding, and chose to walk out into the real sun. Debra Winger chose the exile. She found her peace in the shadows. But not every legend gets to choose their exit. In the same years that Debra was fighting for her truth, another alpha was ruling the world. A man who was once the highest paid star on television. A man who owned the sky, and who looked like he was carved out of marble. But, unlike Debra, his smoking gun wasn't a choice to walk away. It was a silent internal collapse. While Debra was finding herself at Harvard, this legend was losing his mind in a hospital room, forgotten by the very industry that had once paid him $250,000 a week. He didn't find peace. He found a $250,000 silence that would eventually lead him to a grave no one visited for years. You think you know the cost of the spotlight? You think you know what happens when the toughest man in America finally breaks? Click the video on your screen right now to uncover the devastating fate of the ghost of the sky. The file is open. Are you ready to see the end of the dream?